Welcome to the Terry Lecture, second of 3 Terry Lectures by Judith Farquhar. I'm Tom Neer, and I teach and perform research at Yale through the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. As a member of the Terry Lecture Committee, it is my privilege to welcome you to the second of these 3 Terry Lectures presented by Judith Farquhar, collectively entitled Reality, Reason, and Action in and Beyond Chinese Medicine. Judith Farquhar is an American anthropologist who studies traditional medicine, popular culture, and everyday life in contemporary China. She has published papers focusing on a diverse range of anthropological areas, including medical anthropology, the anthropology of knowledge and of embodiment, critical theory and critical studies, and the theories of reading, writing, and translation. Professor Farquhar is the Max Palevsky Professor Emerita in the Department of Anthropology and the College at the University of Chicago, and also serves as a faculty director at the University of Chicago Center in Beijing. Before arriving at the University of Chicago, she taught at McGill University and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Professor Farquhar's lectures draw on the science and practice of traditional Chinese medicine to address enduring and challenging ontological, epistemological, and ethical questions. From the Western perspective, Chinese medicine is often viewed as mystical or superstitious, and its efficacy has been thought of as a matter of naive faith. By contrast, Professor Farquhar's lectures consider how the modern, rationalized, and scientific field of traditional Chinese medicine constructs its very real objects, that is, bodies, symptoms, medicines, drugs, and how experts think through and sort out pathology and health, and how contemporary doctors act responsibly to humanistic ethical ends, seeking out the root of bodily disorder. The first lecture presented an approach to understand the myriad of things of classic Chinese metaphysics. All of Professor Farquhar's Terry lectures contributes to the thesis that systematic Chinese medicine, which is no longer superstitious or a pseudo-science, can become a philosophical ally and a rich resource to a more capacious science. Will you please join me in providing a warm welcome to Professor Farquhar?
Thank you so much, Tom. I love the way you changed that word to capricious from capacious.
Capacious, thank you.
A more capacious science. But capricious is good, too. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I see some of you have come back, and that's very gratifying. We're going to move forward, and I hope that some of the foundation that I laid in Lecture 1 is not too much missed by those of you who weren't here the first time. Oh, no. There's something wrong with this slide. Oh, no. It looks good on the screen, but it's not working. Okay, I'm going to have to read this and skip this slide. All right, this is my epigraph for the talk. It's a small saying called medicine that translates as medicine is thought. 医者医也. All right, I have another slide later. I hope it works when we really have to discuss this. But medicine is thought. All right. In my first lecture, I observed that diagnosis in biomedicine refers to a way of knowing apart, and suggested that Chinese medical ways of knowing are able to recognize living things as things, even while they're fully embedded in active vital systems. And I spoke of medical things, diseases and patterns, organs and visceral systems, as being composed and assembled, even as they are being perceived or discovered. To know life's processes without dissecting the dead, to understand a body's events without controlling variables in a laboratory or a clinical trial. This requires a kind of disciplined perception that is not only Chinese, rather it is preeminently practical and clinical. Chinese medicine is not the only form of medicine that knows how to know in the clinic while encountering a living person and being required to act. Far from it. I quoted Nathan Sivan in Lecture 1 as he argued that medicine everywhere is more an art than a science. But modern traditional Chinese medicine, being required in the mid-20th century to construct a national curriculum that could produce good doctors, has perforce been self-conscious about how the art and science of clinical knowing should be structured and cultivated. My research has learned much from Chinese medicine's modern pedagogical orderliness and philosophical reflexivity. I've been so lucky. 20th century leaders in the development of Chinese medicine have been not only scientists and clinicians, they have also been teachers and philosophers, and they have written a lot about their practice. So bear with me as I continue in this lecture to translate from their discourse, their world, and their practice of both teaching and healing. Okay, that one worked at least. In the first lecture, I mentioned a modern logical approach to the clinical encounter known as 辩证论治, pattern discernment, and therapy determination. This diagram summarizes some disciplined habits of thought or forms of reasoning that have characterized the practice of many TCM doctors trained since the 1960s. TCM is the modern abbreviation for traditional Chinese medicine. For those who are uncomfortable with the epistemological cutting involved in the knowing apart of biomedical diagnosis, 辩证论治, this system, offers what might be called cognosis, or knowledge through recognition of pattern, knowing together, we could say. In Lecture 1, I also discussed the thing that is the target of this knowing together process, the pattern, or zhenghe, that forms a gathered or composed thing, a constellation of processes that are all too real, and which clinical artistry knows as a resonating network of pathophysiological events. This one worked. Okay. In today's lecture, inspired by the position stated in this lecture's epigraph, medicine is thought, I want to explicate some of the thinking involved in the practical work of Chinese medicine. Once again, the verbs will be important: gathering, perceiving, appreciating, choosing among possibilities, inferring, reasoning, and more. And in keeping with Chinese grammar, both ancient and modern, some nouns will have to be turned into verbs. Working in translation through some basic logics and actions of the clinical encounter, I want to first explain modes of inference that link manifest signs to unseen pathologies, and then consider how a patterned illness process can be discerned and named. But first, so we don't forget that we're talking about thought and reasoning in general, let's look at the verb in my epigraph in this saying, medicine is thought. This is an ancient phrase that has recently been often invoked by those in China who would make philosophy from medicine. The verbal form in yiye is the most basic copula of classical Chinese, the syntactical ye at the end of the phrase that characterizes and defines a thing by pointing to another thing. Yiye has an emphatic quality, a tone of clearing away the cobwebs and stating the obvious fact, which we are in danger of missing. Medicine really, after all, boils down to nothing but thinking. Really, period, right? And this copula works both ways, logically. Thought is also a kind of medicine, or at least among the varieties of thought, medicine is an important subset. That is, the realm of thought includes medicine, and it's important to know that. Yiye thus beautifully charters my task in this lecture to persuade you that any thinking person should want to grasp how Chinese medicine thinks. So let me turn now to some modern Chinese medical thinking about thought and, incidentally, about pathology. In 1935, an influential historian, publisher, and medical practitioner named Xie Guan wrote a lapidary history and explication of traditional Chinese medicine. It's a small book written in concise and resonant classical Chinese, and it was influential for a while, though it never achieved the fame I think it deserves. At the time Xie was writing, his field was in crisis, with millions of medical practitioners throughout China having just narrowly escaped an attempted national ban on their work by modernizing biomedical interests. China was already at war with the Japanese, and the nation was deeply divided by warlordism and the struggle between the nationalist and communist parties. The proponents of what was then called national medicine had little time and few resources to advance the modernizing and conserving and also nationalist agenda that many of them shared. Heightened politics notwithstanding, Xie Guan was a scholar and a theorist. He liked to insist that medicine is thought. Another of his pithy slogans is also frequently cited in Chinese medicine today: Li Fa Fang Yao, patterning, method, composing, and medicines. It was often asserted to me when I was first studying Chinese medicine in Guangzhou in the early 1980s that these four words, Li Fa Fang Yao, epitomized the essence of the field. I didn't get this at all at the time. My awkward translation here indicates how miscellaneous and inadequate this phrase appeared to me. It did not seem to be summing up an essence of any kind, but I'm sticking with the awkward translation for various reasons. Lately, I've been reflecting on these words after reading Xie Guan's brilliant little intellectual history, in which he proposed this slogan. Let's look at the first component of his four-term list. Li is a much-used term of vast importance in the history of Chinese philosophy, though its most primitive meaning is pattern, as in the grain of wood or the current of a stream. It has long been translated by philosophers, especially those steeped in Neo-Confucian metaphysics, as principle. But that translation over-idealizes the concept, even as it was used by the most metaphysical of Chinese philosophers. To my mind, a principle is not the same as a pattern, and a pattern is a more material kind of thing. By contrast with this translational idealism, I cannot resist giving you the list of short glosses provided in my online Chinese-English dictionary. Li is texture or grain. This is a pretty concrete thing, right? Even if it's not a freestanding object. Inner essence, intrinsic order. Is this hinting at the idealism of principle, an inherent Platonic form? Reason, logic, truth, science, especially natural science, and especially physics, actually. These are modern translations of Li. And at this point, the dictionary shifts to the everyday beneath philosophy. Li means to manage, to pay attention to run affairs, to handle, to put in order, to tidy up. This latter list reflects the fact that Li is a verb form in everyday life. I must straighten up my desk. I should conform my checkbook to the bank statement, that sort of thing. And it's even more interesting in the negative. Don't mind me, bu li wa. I'm just along for the ride. If Li is all these philosophical and mundane things at once, and if it is used as a verbal, which is pretty clear in Li Fa Fang Yao in that phrase, then it helps us quite a bit as we try to think Chinese medical thinking. And it helped Xie Guan as he tried to modernize and summarize Chinese medicine. Note again the structure of the phrase. It might be characterized as verb, result, two predicates with medicine as the implicit subject of both. What Chinese medicine does, Xie was saying, is more or less abstractly reason its way to a method. Then, following that method, compose a drug formula, that is, a prescription. Only then can it assemble the very concrete bundle of medicines that will be handed over to the patient. I will return to the work of composing drugs together in Fang formulas in Lecture 3. And the last term, Yao, medicines, reminds us of the question of the thing that I considered in the first lecture. Herbal medicines are very concrete things, quite salient to the practicing doctor, and each of them has a history showing it as resulting from a very complex gathering and knowing practice. But of these four words, Li is the most powerful notion. By the 20th century, modernist ideas about reason, logic, truth, and science ruled in China. By adopting for Chinese medicine a philosophical term that encompassed modern science, reason, and truth, while dragging along with it a long history and a vast literature in Chinese, which is to say, retaining the term's primary meaning as pattern, Xie Guan was being very canny indeed. When I reflect on and read about the historical moment in which Xie Guan was writing, I must conclude. Xie was making an early gesture in the invention of a theory-practice divide for China. He was not alone. The political pressures that were making theory into a thing underpinning an ancient clinical art are too complex for me to describe here. But some policymakers at the time were arguing for keeping the effective herbal drugs of Chinese medicine and discarding everything else, especially the traditional thinking of the field. What's interesting about this is that everyone who does a history of 20th century Chinese medicine points out that there was this mid-century movement to throw out all the thinking, all the theory, and to keep the drugs. However, what they don't notice is that nobody before Xie was really talking about theory or a theory and practice divide. So the theory and practice suddenly but looks like a very modern couple. It's not something that you could find everywhere in every knowledge regime throughout history. But it's not an accident that Xie Li Fa Fang Yao took hold in the 1930s and was still urged on me as an important banner for Chinese medical development 50 years after Xie first voiced his formula. He and his contemporaries realized, as their nation struggled toward modern statehood, a modern science must have so-called theoretical foundations. It must be rational. But a self-consciously traditional medicine must find its rational foundation in classical philosophy. In formulas like this one, the field was both resisting and exemplifying science. Look again at our 4 words. There is an immensely complex stance involved in the way that patterning Li is thought to produce a method, a specific form of intervention in illness. And this stance is repeated as the structured composition of the formula yields a collection of things, which is to say a bundle of drugs, medicines you can take home and boil up. Theory practice, a science both ancient and modern declares itself in this phrase. And Li, or the grain of reasoning, rules in the field of medicine. Now, having promised some empirical answers to how medical reasoning might work, let's focus on the discerning patterns side, the left side of my master diagram, beginning with the 4 examinations. The importance of this step in the process was recently reinforced for me. Less than a month ago, I accompanied a group of American undergraduate students to visit a Chinese medical clinic in Beijing. Our group was lucky to be hosted by a senior doctor who, with a very tolerant patient by his side, gave a brief lecture introducing the field of Chinese medicine. What Dr. Ping most wanted to emphasize in the context of this rather markedly traditional private clinic was the 4 examinations. He proceeded to demonstrate by performing them on the patient, examining the tongue, palpating the pulse, drawing our attention to facial color, rehearsing a bit of the patient's history. Like so many other experts I've spoken with over the years, he obviously considered the disciplined perception enabled by the 4 examinations to be the foundation of Chinese medical thinking. Dr. Ping was showing us a widely taught, even a required protocol for clinical work in traditional medicine. But why were the 4 examinations made into a protocol? We could also ask, why are there only 4? In practice, these 4 modes of clinical observation limit the infinite information that can be gleaned from a sufferer's body and history. Even something as apparently straightforward as a human body is what William James called a quasi-chaos. He figures his quasi-chaos as a kind of unknowable physical core around which floats a vast cloud of experiences, only some of which can become part of the perceptual experience of another, for example, a diagnostician. Limits are essential in a medical encounter, as I recognize every time I talk to my doctor and leave her clinic a little uncertain whether she understands all aspects of my condition. Some of our experiences are worth no medical attention after all, while other symptomatic conditions, which might not be conscious experiences at all, must be tricked into showing themselves, for example, with ultrasound, sphygmometers, and blood tests. Anyone who hopes to know anything in a medical quasi-chaos is much like Alice playing croquet through the looking glass, with a curious flamingo for a mallet and a scared hedgehog for a croquet ball. Chinese medical philosophy is vitalist. That's why Joseph Needham, the biochemist I mentioned in the first lecture, devoted his scientific life to its particular forms of morphogenesis, I think. This field knows that the world is endlessly giving birth to life and ceaselessly transforming transformations. This Shang Shang Hua Hua is the fundamental process of the universe coming into being, both from the very beginning and every day in our mundane reality. Philosophers of Chinese medicine emphasize this idea to emphasize their distance from a world of fixed and immutable material objects. If we note that Alice, trying to play the game according to rules that keep changing, is herself as unknown and unpredictable as are her mallet flamingo and hedgehog ball, not to mention the impulsive red queen nearby, then we get an idea of why the most important form of action in medical diagnosis might be a disciplined limitation of what is perceptible. In a universe that is constantly emerging as myriad things from the hidden springs of the great way, the Tao, in a landscape full of things that constantly metamorphose or change into each other and create new forms, some disciplining of perception would seem to be required. The four examinations impose a discipline, but they also collect quite a lot of information. As can be seen in this slide, please don't try to memorize it. It's just here as a kind of example. All right. These methods are looking, listening, smelling, asking, and palpating. Here I summarize some of the categories of information that are collected through the four examinations. This is a protocol that is attentive to a great deal of patient and doctor experience. Colors of tongue range from carmine to nearly black, with tongue coating that can have not only different colors, but qualities like dryness, thickness, greasiness, patchiness, etc. There are 28 possible pulse qualities discernible at 18 possible sites on the wrists. There are differential breathing sounds and weird voice sounds to be listened to. And then there are the reported qualities of urine and stool, sleeping patterns, experiences of appetite and indigestion, grumpiness or euphoria, excessive dreams. It goes on and on. The four examinations amount to a phenomenology of pathological process. They collect aspects of the patient's experiences of disorder, expertly perceiving and discriminating qualities perceptible on the surface of a life in a kind of radical empiricist mode of attention. But studying this list, you might protest. Your primary care physician here in New Haven, or a medical student studying physical examination and history taking, would quickly point out that this method fails to catch many important things. Exact readings of blood pressure and body temperature are missing. Neither the heartbeat nor the optic fundus nor the cervix is examined. Neurological reflexes are not tested. And of course, every structure that would be visualized with X-rays, CT scanning, and MRI remains in the dark. This last figure of speech and real situation helps us to see something important about that dark space of the body, interior. The four examinations collect surface manifestations almost exclusively, especially if we consider that the patient's verbal account of his symptomatic experience is yet another kind of manifestation made present in speech in the moment of the clinic for the consideration of the doctor. Modern Chinese medicine has only partly adopted the visualizing technologies that help biomedicine detect our body's silent lesions, the tumor, the malformed optic nerve, the colonic polyp. And this neglect of technology could be seen as a failure and a shortcoming of the field. But Chinese medical polemicists point out in parallel that biomedicine lacks sophistication in both diagnostics and systematics. So-called Western medicine is deaf to the many qualities resonating through the wrist pulses and disorders of the whole body, metabolic or immune system disease, for example, have to be thought about and managed piecemeal, at best with drug cocktails, rather than treated rationally as a pattern in Chinese medical terms. How do the four examinations fit into Chinese medical knowing practice? What role do they play in a reasoning process? What part of Li Fa Fang Yao are they? It is easy to see them as a kind of medical semiotics, which is to say, a disciplined way of reading signs. Reading for meaning, we might even say. We're all familiar with this form of reading, whether or not we're physicians. Suffering from a bad cold, lower back pain, migraines, a touch of senile dementia, we put together a narrative that explains why this set of symptoms, and there are always several, has happened now, together, to me, and not to my family and friends. And we extend this narrative to predict, hopefully, how long it will take for our symptomatic discomforts to change or go away. But the stories we tell ourselves as patients and sufferers are idiosyncratic and unreliable compared to those that are developed in the pattern discerning process. The 4 examinations yield information that Chinese doctors can reason with, understood as signs of pathological processes affecting the whole body. The set of signs they collect is placed in relation to the knowledge accumulated in China's famous 2,000 years of medical experience. This is a set phrase, in ways to which we will soon turn. If I am told that I suffer from deficient spleen function with damp heat, as I have been in fact, and as Dr. Ping's patient was told when I visited that clinic in August, I might still feel that my Chinese doctor has failed to see the whole picture of my personal afflictions. But given that the pattern the doctor discerns can yield a carefully crafted intervention, a formula, and medicines tailored to the state of pathophysiological play in my body, which he has inferred in a skilled reading, I have to be impressed with the sensitivity of his account of my body and its meanings. But let me approach this emphasis on the 4 examinations and the knowing practice of which they are a part in a slightly more historical way. I want to share a few statements from a small but absolutely classic 1959 book called Introduction to Chinese Medicine. These excerpts are from the preface written by the author Qin Wei, an important founder of modern Chinese medicine. The Chinese Communist Party has long emphasized our nation's medical heritage, telling us Chinese medicine and pharmacy is a great treasure house. I included this sentence only because if I omitted it, those of you who know China in the 1950s would say, she's not reading from the 1950s. This is an obligatory sentence, has to be there. When Chinese medicine treats disease, it centrally relies on an integrated set of therapeutic methods consisting of patterning and method, composing, and medicines. This is our old friend Li Fa Fang Yao. I recognize the surface appearances of Chinese medicine from these 4 aspects. Through them, we can understand Chinese medicine's specificity and grasp Chinese medicine's regular patterns of treating illness, and thus adopt the most correct method of studying Chinese medicine. So in this book's account, the various topics are divided up under the 4 sections: Li Lun, theory, Li Lun, methodology, Fa Zi, formulary, Fang Ji, and pharmaceuticals, Yao Wu, so as to give a more detailed introduction. Several things interest me about this prefatory remark. Of course, I'm happy to see historian Xie Guan's pithy formula of Li Fa Fang Yao recapitulated so prominently and under the aegis of the People's Republic of China's Ministry of Health after 25 years, just as it was repeated to me by my authoritative teachers in a 1980s Chinese medical college. And I like to note that Xie's Li of the 1930s has by 1959 been transformed into the modern term for theory, Li Lun. Really, I could have done these Terry lectures just by giving you translations from Qin Wei's little book, Introduction to Chinese Medicine. It's quite brilliant. He also defines, refines, and explains the methodology of discerning patterns and determining therapies, taking it up at a crucial moment in its development as a ruling logic for the field, all the while linking this clinical methodology to Li Fa Fang Yao and insisting on certain Chinese specificities of reasoning and knowing. But what really impressed me about this quote from Qin's preface was his mention of surface appearances. The word he used for this is not a medical word, and as far as I know, hardly anyone later picked up this notion for their writing about the 4 examinations or any other component of the pattern discerning and therapy determining process. Perhaps the reading process, characteristic of medical semiotics, was already too firmly established as a method of reasoning to merit any particular comment. This would also be the case for Western medicine, by the way, as Dr. Summers pointed out last week after my first talk. But look at the logic of this statement. Perhaps like Dr. Ping in the clinic I visited last month, Dr. Qin is here putting his recognition of appearances at the foundation of his thinking practice. He processes what appears on the surface through pattern, method, formula, and even drugs to deal with the even more defining task of reading signs. In the process, this becomes knowing from experience. The disciplined 4 examinations are the beginning of discernment. Their signs present themselves to be read on the surfaces of bodies and in patients' accounts of illness experience. In the modernist natural sciences, especially perhaps the experimental regimes of bioscience, surface appearances are felt to be deceiving. My clinical interviewer in Chicago ignores my firm belief that my medical history is going to be just like my paternal aunt's, because I happen to know that we are very much alike. The doctor wants to know only the health history of my parents and siblings. Facts that seem relevant to the sufferer from jet lag or irritable bowel syndrome, say, can be treated as a distraction or even a delusion by the evidence-based medical expert. Experimental science must rip aside the veil of what seems to be the case. Surface relationships must be critically carved away through control of variables and statistical analysis. But in the traditional Chinese sciences, here I use these terms traditional and science very deliberately actually, appearances cannot be banished. Rather, what is manifest on the surface of things is the only reliable guide leading us to a deeper understanding of life. So let's talk about manifestations, images, and how to read them. In these lectures, we've seen Qinbo Wei's surface appearances before, and the word we've used for them, xiang, has often been translated as image. The 4 examinations list I just showed you names some images. Pulse image and tongue image are very important, as Dr. Ping emphasized. With regard to visceral systems imagery, which is summarized on this table, which you saw the last time, xiang is a visible image that makes visceral activity apparent. Examples might be a flush in the face, where the heart system manifests, or bloodshot eyes, where the liver system vents. The name for this way of thinking, visceral systems imagery, presumes that hidden visceral networks throw up an image that can be perceived by the senses of an observer. The most thoughtful and witty usage of the word xiang also appeared in Lecture 1 when I talked about Dr. Lu Guangxin's word for object or thing, which was duixiang, or the image we face. This last notion is the most suggestive for our efforts to understand ways of thinking and reading and translating and even intervening. Why? Because, and here I must dip once again into metaphysics, the active cosmos throws up appearances. It is not just the images we need to apprehend if we are to intervene in illness. It is the process by which they are generated and to which they lead our thinking. Chinese medicine holds that pathological and physiological processes of the whole body are more unitary and more coherent, more holistic, the modern theorists say, than the miscellany of myriad phenomena, illness signs that present themselves to our human senses. The endless transformative life process has its patterns, its grain or current, and these can be grasped by the skilled doctor. Of course, as I've argued, even ignorant patients like me have their hunches and stories about what's really going on inside their bodies. But the kind of medical knowing that can effectively read all those images, link the manifestations to their hidden sources, is disciplined. The doctor's perception becomes medically conceptual, Chairman Mao might say, when he links the results of the 4 examinations to the analytical systems available in the Chinese medical archive. I will show that these analytics are preeminently correlative and classificatory. As such, they rely on conventional or traditional kinships and distinctions, mobilizing several great systems of natural linkage and discontinuity. Let me approach this so-called correlative science by listing a few of the pattern-discerning logical technologies that are popular in clinics of Chinese medicine these days, and then showing them at work in a description of a well-known pattern. Here are some of the analytic systems that are ready to hand for the Chinese doctor. 8 rubrics, 4 sectors, 6 channels, visceral systems, and Jing, Qi, and blood. I've not included all possible ones. These is just for didactic reasons. I'm keeping it simple. One of these you may already have some hunches about after having seen my table summarizing the 5 visceral systems in Lecture 1. The slide I used then, summarizing the network connections traditionally associated with each of the 5 great visceral systems, gives you an idea of the kind of correlations and distinctions that might be invoked as clinical understanding moves from the perceptible image to the underlying systematic process. It would be rare to analyze a presenting illness with reference only to visceral systems, however. This series of 3 slides lists some of the conventional correlations of 6 of the 8 rubrics, an analytic technique that is almost always considered. Just about any sign can be classified as, I'm going to go back, cool or warm, shallow or deep, repletion or depletion. And the 4th couple of rubrics, yin and yang, follow the first 3 sets quite logically. If you understand yin and yang, I'm not showing those correlations. You can see the connections, but I'm not showing those correlations just to keep things a little simpler. And though the classification of facts collected in the 4 examinations as falling under one or another of the 8 rubrics is sometimes intuitively obvious, a fever and dry mouth are clearly warm and yang, basically the correlations are conventional and traditional. In Maoist idiom, they arise from the several thousand years of recorded experience of the masses' struggle against disease, and they need to be memorized by the medical student and kept in mind by the practitioner. Let's get just a little closer to the actual clinical work with an example. Suppose the patient presents with some heart symptoms, such as palpitations. A correlation in the heart visceral system is easy to guess, but this initial hunch doesn't take you very far, and it only enhances your curiosity about other possible signs of pathology. Taking the pulse, you note that the qualities of pulsation are slender and weak. These, conventionally by correlation, tell you to expect that qi and blood are both depleted. And you might also note the confirming fact that the patient's face is pale, nearly gray. Looking at the tongue, you observe that the body of the tongue is unusually pale, a sign you can correlate under the rubrics depletion and cold. Recall that these are 2 of the 8 rubrics. If the tongue coating is at the same time white, this indicates again that qi and blood might be simultaneously depleted. Invoking qi and blood, we can see that the Jing-qi blood analytic is also brought to bear. This is not such a deep-seated disorder, however, that Jing essence would be considered to be affected. And there's no evidence on examination that non-blood fluids are depleted either. This is a little technical note that I have to always include these things because it's part of the thinking. At about this point, you'll be thinking that since the heart rules the blood in the vessels and vents at the tongue and manifests in the face, well, you pretty much landed on a fairly standard pattern, heart qi depletion. Then when you turn to the asking examination, you can perhaps impress the patient by asking whether he is often forgetful, perspires for no reason, or has difficulty sleeping. How did you know? Patients sometimes ask. Well, how did you know? Perhaps from having memorized masses of correlations and being fast on your feet as you classify the miscellaneous signs presented by the patient. With your correlational work, you perform a sort of differential diagnosis. You determine that the syndrome is not yet deep-seated in, for example, the blood storage functions of the liver system, and that a general pattern of exhaustion is more due to a shortfall of yang stimulus than to a buildup of yin substance. The pattern identified is now well characterized and set to be linked to a therapeutic intervention. Patterns of disorder are very numerous indeed. This is only one of thousands that are in the literature, almost infinite in theory. Even the conventionally used analytic methods are too many, in a sense. Every pattern discerning practitioner must navigate among many attractive and overlapping options to arrive at a set of correlations and names, a pattern that persuades both him and the patient. Like heart qi depletion, patterns are discerned and named in a way that shows them, to those who know, to be convergences of more general processes. And these processes, known as physiology and pathology in modern Chinese medicine, must be understood if there's to be any successful medical interruption of a disordered flow, nudging the body toward better health. Okay, I have a conclusion now. I began this lecture with a proverb drawn from a very early source, the 5th century book of the latter Han, Ija Iya. Okay, good. Though there is reason to believe that this formula has been invoked from time to time in the long history of Chinese medical argumentation, it recently was made salient again by a writer of Chinese medical theory, Liao Yuchun, writing in 2006, by the way. Ija Iya is the title of his 2006 book subtitled Knowing Chinese Medicine. Here is a part of this modern author's comment on the classical texts. Following Guo Yu's time, which was the 1st century common era when he argued that failures to cure happen mainly when thinking is absent, following Guo Yu's time, a famous master of the southern dynasty, Tao Hongjing, who lived in the 5th century, articulated rather early that medicine is thought. The book of the latter Han states, "Thus it was that Tao intimated medicine is thought. Those who were known as good doctors of old, because they applied limits to their capacity for thinking, they were able to know and treat the patient. All their thoughts arose from the moment, so they didn't woodenly adopt traditional formulas to treat the illness. By implication, they treated every medical formula and strategy. They crafted every medical formula and strategy to the particular pattern they were able to discern through thought. Note that they applied limits to their capacity for thinking, disciplined their imaginations. This limits issue came up before today in my discussion of the 4 examinations. Chinese medicine's tools of perception and conception are very rich, but not infinitely so, and they are limited on purpose, this classic source seems to say. The author goes on, summarizing the above, it was really after the Song dynasty, that would be about 1000, that doctors frequently pointed out that medicine is thought. The Taiping Shenghui Fang, Sacred Remedies of the Taiping, lays it out. Yes, medicine is thought. Illness is born on the inside, and medicines adjust from the outside. Doctors illuminate the pattern of illness, and medicines act on it like a god. This magical efficacy arises from engagement with the sorts of phenomena and from minute participation in the transformations and the changes. This is the way of subtlety, the very limit of thought in use. This brilliant summation from more than 1,000 years ago completes the point I wanted to make in this lecture. And because it cannot do otherwise for a pragmatist like me, it also leads us toward Lecture 3 on the nature of human medical action. Let me conclude for today then by paraphrasing this lapidary list in the language I've been developing in these lectures. This is my paraphrase. Yes, medicine is purely and simply a way of thinking. Pathology has its genesis on the inside of our bodies, but it expresses itself in signs on the surface and in human experience. Medicines, on the other hand, are brought to bear to adjust the course of the illness process from the outside. It is the doctor's job to brilliantly perceive the pattern of disorder, and if he does, the herbal medicines he composes can magically affect the pathological process. The healer's effectiveness arises from his intimate grasp of the traditional correlations and classifications, and from her intimate attention to the unceasing transformations of living experience. This way brings us near to the subtlest things, and it is fundamentally pragmatic. Medicine is the limit case of thought in use. So I'll stop there and get ready for tomorrow. So I think we have time for some questions.
Yeah, we have time for questions. So we just ask that if you have a question, it be a question, not a statement. And go ahead and line up. We could take the questions at either of the microphones here in the aisles. Please.
I was thinking about how Western medicine is really divided into 3 aspects: the physical, the mental, and the emotional. Can you comment on how Chinese medicine looks at the emotional and the mental illness?
They don't divide it up that way. I sort of chose some of those symptom lists to indicate that what we think of as cognitive or emotional symptoms are lumped right in there in the 4 examinations. And so the doctor is thinking about the whole body. And tomorrow I'm going to talk about a symptom like panic attack, which is considered to be, anyway, not physical, right, in our clinics. But it's definitely a symptom, and it's taken very seriously by Chinese doctors. And they will look for correlated phenomena. You know, they'll look for physical phenomena like sweating or, you know, a feeling of compression in the chest. So that and actually, if you think about it, every time you're having a mental health episode, we all have them, of course, think about how you feel in your whole body, you know. I mean, don't you feel short of breath? Isn't there a kind of pressure in your chest? Don't you have weird aches and pains? These kinds of symptoms are not simply thought to be epiphenomenal to the psychological crisis by a Chinese doctor. They're part of the pattern, and they have to be taken very seriously. So the divide is not there. Now, today, of course, we have lots of Chinese medical doctors who are specializing in emotional disorders. And a lot of them are doing it by retranslating modernist emotional disorders into a classical, holistic language of a whole body disorder. And then they can write an herbal prescription that should help. Make sense?
Yes, I was just thinking that the other sort of way things cross over is, for example, I read about a Chinese doctor who was able to diagnose a heart ailment, a very specific heart ailment, from the smell of the patient's urine. Whereas you would think, oh, urine, ergo, gastrointestinal, you know.
Different
but it was
systems, right,
jumping
right.
over to coronary.
Yeah.
I have a question that comes from my interest in history of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
When people talk about Western medicine, there's often a conversation about why it is that bloodletting, for example, sort of fades away by the end of the 19th century. And we don't really have a very good explanation of why that happens. We just see that it happened. So I wanted to ask about traditional Chinese medicine, and I know one of the strengths of the mid to late 20th century is it was conceived of as timeless, or in other words, it could always draw on the past, that there wasn't that sort of break from the way people did it incorrectly to the modern way. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to know, are there examples, in fact, of certain kinds of diagnostic or therapeutic elements where you see practitioners of Chinese medicine say, we do it this way now, we don't do it that way? Is there?
Oh, lots and lots, because there's every kind of mixture of biomedical, psychological, and Chinese, you know, multiple systems kinds of ways of thinking about these things. And it's a good way to make a career, to develop your own hybrid, to develop your own combination of things. And so, and many modern trained doctors are rejecting most of the classical material. On the other hand, there are some of the most innovative and some of the most elitely trained doctors with the best access to all kinds of biomedical technology and clinical resources are going back to the classic books and finding techniques that are not in the standard TCM textbooks, but they're, you know, techniques like the timing of working out according to divination, the proper timing for an acupuncture intervention, right? And so they'll find this system from some 6th century, 7th century work, and they'll work on it and develop it in the clinic until they've got something that they think is really worth staking their reputation on. So there's every different kind of appropriation of and rejection of the past.
And for both the appropriation and the rejection, does this become part of the sort of published research literature, or
Yes.
is it more clinic
Yes,
bound?
and that's been one of the great. I kind of experienced it as a huge tragedy that there is this vast literature. When I was at the College of Traditional Medicine in the early 1980s, and this is when Chinese medicine is just beginning to revive as a huge field after the Cultural Revolution, there were 27 monthly journals of Chinese medicine in the library. There are many more now. And in these journals, there are research reports, there are speculative writing, there's classical scholarship, there's case reports, there's my memoirs of my teacher's experience, there's all kinds of fascinating writing, all of it promising, thoughtful ways of recasting the resources that are available. It's huge. And so what's frustrating to me and what I feel is rather a tragedy is that people here don't even know it exists. They don't even know that these debates, these discussions, these conversations are going on.
First, thank you so much about your professional lectures, and I really appreciate. And as you talk about the patterns, the medicine, and the method, and I have heard that the traditional Chinese medicine doctor will treat the different patient with different disease with the same medicine, the same prescription or the same formula. But whereas maybe the treat the same patient with the same disease, but with the different medicine and prescription. So I guess it's according to the different patterns. And what do you think of that?
Well, they say in the textbooks, even in the textbooks, but certainly in the classrooms and in the clinics, the doctors will correct me and other students when we try to woodenly apply a principle from the literature, from the textbook. They'll say, no.
Yeah.
我们是因事因人因地看病.
Yes.
We look at illness according to the time, the place, and the person. Mm-hmm. And that means that your 4 examinations has to be sensitive enough to pick up all the specificities of that case. That means that the same doctor might treat a patient who comes in with heart qi depleted, with liver system involvement or something like that. He might treat 6 patients in a row in which he thinks that's the pattern differently because he knows that these 6 patients have different characteristics.
Yes.
Right? So there's that. But also a more difficult and problematic thing from the point of view of modern science is a lot of doctors, or in a clinic where you have 6 doctors practicing and patients, maybe it's a 脾胃血说 clinic, a spleen stomach disorders clinic. 6 doctors practicing. Patients come in with very similar patterns. And each doctor will treat very similar patterns differently. And the question that the student always asks is, well, are they all the right treatment?
Yes, that's the point, yes.
Yeah, it's a dilemma.
proved.
Are they all the right treatment? The doctors will say they could all be right.
Yes.
Because there's so many different strategies that we can, so many different pathways we can take through our analytic resources.
Yes.
And there are plenty of ways to be wrong.
Yeah,
and their colleagues will happily point out to them that they're wrong when they're wrong.
Yes.
Right? But there are also plenty of ways to be right.
Yeah, so this is the chicken problem, that because we want to prove that traditional medicine is very useful and is correct, but the different patterns and different prescriptions, so made it a tricky problem to prove it with the modern science. Yes.
Right. But it's part of the perceived responsiveness of the field. Mm-hmm. Patients like it. They like to feel that they're going to get a completely customized treatment. And doctors feel that this is part of their expertise, is that they may not do it exactly like their colleague does, but this is because they know they have sensitive techniques.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you. I was intrigued by Bernie Siegel in his non-conventional approach to treating cancer patients, exceptional cancer patients. And he certainly made inroads through the Yale medical system, as you know. So my thought is this, and maybe you could add to it. What Bernie found out is that there is a lot of self-healing potential within the individual once they can tap into some of their own illness through visualization. But more that, the question is this. When a Chinese doctor does an analysis, do they take into consideration some of the metaphysical properties, what Bernie was touching upon in his analysis and approaching perhaps self-healing? Because as we know, the energy from acupuncture is phenomenal, and it's nothing more than controlling with the needle the energy that goes through us. But if we can harness the power of the individual process. So can you give us a little correlation between that?
Well, that quote I ended on, I'm going to go back to it next time, so I'm not going to get it back up on the screen. But that quote I ended on mentioned about an intimate participation in the changes and the transformations and the changes. That participation is the carefully chosen translation of a word that means participation. And I'm going to emphasize this a bit more next time. I've always thought of, actually don't use this word tomorrow, I don't think, in what I've prepared, but I've always thought of what the Chinese doctor does as nudging natural process in a more wholesome direction. And that's how they think of it. And you will see in the language that we'll go over tomorrow, if you're here, that they don't claim to eradicate any causes. They don't claim to radically transform a pathological process. They claim to join in with it and push it and adjust its course, is the phrase I think I do use tomorrow, right? So that's, this is a cosmology, a metaphysics of the great way of nature, in which human beings, doctor and patient alike, are participating. Mm-hmm. They don't get to control it. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
Take another question.
Okay.
Sir?
Actually, I just want to make a comment and also see your opinion. Chinese medicine is experienced, evolved medicine. So a physician to see the patient take a long time to mature in order to make a proper diagnosis.
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Take time.
Yes,
to mature.
It takes time. Yes, yes.
And
yeah.
So the question raised by one of the audience is among 6 patients who is better diagnosed. That's that actually hard to say.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
For sure, 10 years experience is not sufficient.
Yeah.
But if you're looking back into our medical practice, also takes time to mature. So I think it's also experience becoming important role.
Right.
And the Western medicine, so far called, so that experience base is based on thousands of years of experience. And for our evidence-based, really we're talking about is less than 100 years.
Well, it's actually a lot less than that since we've started trying to build an evidence base under that name. This is why the evidence-based medicine people are scrambling so hard. They're trying to get all the data, all the big databases there so they can be drawn on as a kind of a resource that's large. Yeah, yeah.
So actually, if you think about it, we often claim we want to learn from history, but we actually often forgot there's a history there.
Yeah.
We have not taken advantage of it.
Yeah.
Even including some of traditional medicine in Europe or in every other part of the world. Yeah. The second is there's a very...
Wait. Mm-hmm. You're saying too much. I want to just agree with you that the history is very important to Chinese medical people, which is why even the radical young doctors, the highly trained scientific doctors that I know in Beijing, are forcing their students to read case books from the past, forcing their students to analyze prescriptions from the whole archive. They insist that students read history, even beyond the history textbooks, right? So there's that. And also the time issue. Because Chinese medicine's practice relies so heavily on experience, two kinds of experience at least. One is the individual clinician's experience, who is drawing on patients' experiences, which they tell him and which he can see, right? But also the experience, as you say, of hundreds of years of recorded practice. And that is thought of as experienced by Chinese doctors. And so now, I don't want to make this just Chinese, because the point I made at the end of my first book about Chinese medicine is that this question of experienced clinical practice, diagnostic virtuosity, wise decision-making about therapeutics. Everybody in Chinese medical, in Western medical, biomedical clinics knows this too. And that's why interns and residents have to spend so much time working under senior residents, senior doctors. Because everybody knows that there's no substitute for clinical experience. But the only difference is that in Chinese medicine, because they have been on the defensive for 100 years, they have had to make that explicit in their curricula, in their pedagogy. They've had to say, we're going to teach you how to gain experience and learn from experience, because that's absolutely crucial. They've made it explicit. Biomedical teaching has not made that explicit in all the same way, in my understanding.
Yeah, I think we are not in disagreement.
No, I don't think so either.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to say is actually, I teach in medical school here.
What do you teach?
Pharmacology.
Pharmacology, okay.
And for the past 16 years, I've been working in exploring Chinese medicine in modern medicine.
Great.
And I can see the situation is, the environment is changing. As a matter of fact, there's a convergence of concept of so-called Western medicine and Chinese medicine. Holistic thinking is being considered for Chinese medicine diagnosis, and we are talking system biology, integrative medicine.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a lot of common words.
Yeah. So
And
you have to keep working on that.
And the macroscopic.
Keep pushing that convergence.
Yeah, I actually is. I form a consortium for globalization of Chinese medicine. There are already 157 institution members around the world.
I think we have a question. This will be the last question we
Okay.
take. And I just want to remind everyone before Sir Radden asks her question that we have a lovely reception following our gathering here. Thank you. Please.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm going to ask a question that might seem a little bit far afield, but I couldn't help but think of as I was listening to your talk about the idea of pattern. And I think about the resonance that pattern carries in realms within and beyond medicine that really inspired my thinking. And I'm thinking a lot about the incursion of this phenomenon of big data and the ways in which the kind of phrase of the hour is like pattern recognition, looking at the data.
Yes.
And I just wondered, what you might think to this, because your mode of helping us think pattern as knowledge and thought from traditional Chinese medicine seems like it could be incredibly valuable, not only in the context of thinking about our bodies and our symptoms, but the ways in which a whole new emerging form of digital kinds of knowledge making are changing medicine, but all kinds of modes of life. So I just wanted to invite you to see if there was anything there.
All right, well, I think the pattern recognition work that's going on in the field of big data and systems analysis and so forth is really very fascinating and very important. I think after tomorrow, though, I might have developed a slight divergence from their purposes. Tomorrow I want to talk about action and how we can't even think about thought. We can't even see things without standing on the work that we have to do as healers, as medical people, right? So looking through the lens of the necessity of action, and the particular limits of possible action. You know, there's only so much you can do under current conditions. Looking through that lens, back at big data, at all the things we can know, that limits how we can know that. And the big data people are maybe, sometimes I see some of these digital humanities projects and I think, well, this is all great, but what's the question they're trying to answer?
Right.
What's the problem they're trying to solve?
Right.
And that's what would make it ultimately more interesting to me.
Well, I look forward to the talk tomorrow. Thanks.
Okay, good.
So let's thank Professor Farquhar one more time.